Hey, I heard this quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson last Thursday in English class, and I didn't quite understand what it meant.
Well, I was able to make the class on Thursday. So what's the quote? Maybe I can help you out.
It's, theoretic kidnappers and slave drivers, they esteem each man to be the victim of another, who winds him round his finger by knowing the law of his being, and by such cheap signboards as the color of his beard or the slope of his occiput, reads the inventory of his fortitudes and character.
Well, that sentence can look very confusing, but let's try and work it out, the true meaning of what Emerson is trying to say. Let's start with theoretical kidnappers and slave drivers. These esteem each man the victim of another, who winds him round his finger by knowing the law of his being.
That part was the most confusing for me. I understand that he's saying everyone is a victim of others, and this allows them to be judged on how they look and the way they are raised, but I have no idea what he means by theoretic kidnappers and slave drivers.
I think it means something like those people who believe that others are victims of one another think that they are above everyone else. They think that while others can be judged on things like how they look or are raised, they believe that because they can use these things to control others, that they themselves are unable to be judged on these traits.
That's a very good point. Do you also believe it could mean that these theoretic kidnappers and slave drivers are so thirsty for power that they think the traits to be judged upon are either irrelevant or non-existent?
I can see where you're coming from, but this is not about power per se. If you look at the next part of the quote, and by such cheap signboards as the color of his beard or the slope of his occiput reads the inventories of his fortunes and character, it can be seen that Emerson is not talking about power, but he's talking about how these people just are ignorant to the judgments they can be understood by, and that they are still not a part of all the other people.
Alright, that sounds about right. So, theoretic kidnappers and slave drivers, they esteem each man the victim of another, who winds him around his finger by knowing the law of his being. These kidnappers and slave drivers are merely people who believe they are better than others and cannot be thought of based on traits they have. So the quote could say, people who believe they have no reason to be judged think of others as victims of those around them, who winds him around the finger by knowing the law of his being.
I think that's a good description of this quote in a more modern English. I think it's now time to attack the second half of the quote, which states, and by such cheap signboards as the color of his beard or the slope of his occiput reads the inventory of his fortunes and character. This sentence is very interesting to me because it can be looked at in a few ways. First, I believe we should define something in this sentence. He refers to the slope of his occiput. This is based on the belief of phrenology, which is a science in Emerson's time that said that people could be judged on the slope of their skull.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. That seems like that would be outdated these days. Do you think I could replace that with something more related to our time?
Yeah, sure, I don't see why not.
Okay, so if the quote was written now, it could say something like, and by such cheap signboards as the color of his beard or the neighborhood he grew up in, reads the inventory of his fortitudes and character. Many people think of those who grow up in bad neighborhoods to be a person who might grow into violence and crime, similarly to how Emerson used phrenology.
That is a fantastic relation to our time now. I think that plays right into where Emerson refers to cheap signboards. I believe he is saying that these traits of people, while they can be judged, are not a good understanding of how people actually are, and that is why they are cheap. For example, if we look at the neighborhoods people grow up in, many kids who grow up in a bad neighborhood can just as easily grow up to be the next genius or end up in prison. Both of these things are seen by kids that have been looked at in studies.
I don't think Emerson believes they cannot use these things to judge people, but rather it's such a common occurrence to see these signboards that they're cheap due to the sheer amount of them. There are so many people that we see in bad neighborhoods is that it's impossible to say that they all have an equal chance to grow into someone who didn't turn out rotten because of their neighborhood. The sight of people in bad neighborhoods being arrested is not uncommon and shows a large affinity for a life of crime or violence. So that goes right along with the meaning of cheap, saying that there are so many, and because of that, they can't be more readily read off.
While I believe that is a great point, in class we learned that Emerson was trying to say that he does not believe that we can judge people on these things, but he knows that at the time it is not possible to be free of these ideas, so he hopes that one day we will not be chained down by these ideas.
This quote is really becoming clear to me now. So I think we can agree that the quote is saying, those who believe they are above others, seeing each man a victim of another, who winds him around his finger by knowing the law of his being, and by such cheap signboards as the color of his beard, or the neighborhood he grew up in, reads the inventory of his fortitudes and character.
I think we really have a good understanding of this quote now. Nice job.